Hi folks, Loren here, This Week in Weed TV, and I'm here with Lorraine from the Stand Up for Cannabis and Little Green Trailers and all sorts of great things. We're cheerleaders really, to some extent, a large extent, for Adam Searle's cannabis bill in New South Wales, although I live in Victoria. And let's say hello, Lorraine. Lorraine, hi.
Hi, how are you going?
Good. And what state are you in, other than chaotic?
I'm in Queensland.
There we go. So neither one of us live in New South Wales, but here we are supporting a bill for New South Wales because it actually fixes problems that folks have been looking for, and basically it's the only thing that's been out there that actually legalizes real cannabis for medical use. But it is causing confusion in the marketplace and the community, and I think also folks are a little bit confused because every bill they've seen from government or anybody in politician-wise has not been a good thing, and here we have a good thing and people having a hard time getting their head around it. And we also know it's not perfect, but it's not intended to be. The bill's about 20 pages or less, and they don't address all the baggage and issues of all the other issues from driving and possession amounts. They address them all well enough, but some of this requires enablement. So the bill doesn't say, well, we're going to change this, but what it does do is if it says, well, if cannabis is now legal and you don't need a script, then it makes things happen that weren't necessarily going to happen before. So let's dive in. Lorraine's kind of got some questions. The one we kind of left off with, maybe we start with that one while it's fresh in your mind. And was that around the driving? So my understanding, Lorraine, you can jump in on any of this and correct me if this is where I think this is going. So currently in Australia, you don't actually have to have be impaired with cannabis if you get pulled over and tested. All you have to do is have possession of what they call an illegal substance in your system. And I'm going to type this up just so I'll quote the exact words. This program does not, here we go, This program does not infer impaired driving or driving a motor vehicle under the influence of a drug. It detects the presence of an illicit drug in a subject's oral fluid. Now, this is the problem that the USA has had, is because that breaks your constitutional rights. If it doesn't have to do with impairment, WTF. So, what happens then if they legalize medical cannabis with real cannabis for medical use, and you're registered and you're licensed and the rest of it? So, one possibility.
Well, it would seem to me,
yeah, go ahead.
It would seem to me then, if it's legalized for medicinal use,
Yeah.
then
You're registered.
you no longer have an illicit substance in you.
Absolutely. Now,
So
neither one
it
of
would
us.
seem
Go ahead.
to
Sorry.
me then
Yeah.
that they would have to change the law to say if you have X amount in your system, as opposed to having it register in your system. Because registering in your system, it's not an illicit substance. You are legal to use it.
Correct. Now,
So,
and the interesting thing with this is in the USA and Canada, they have faced the opposite situation where it's legal, but they're having a hard time testing for impairment. So one of the tools they're considering using is the same tests, but not because they're instant and they detect it in your system, and then they use that as an opportunity to test for impairment. But in the end, it comes down to impairment. Now, when I was in Denver in 2015, I guess it was, at the Cannabis Cup, I left a dispensary and got pulled over a block away. And they tell you that, if you get pulled over by the police, and this was a traffic stop with a bus and all the rest of it, if you get stopped by the police in the USA, they tell you, make sure everything you've got is in the back, da-da-da-da-da. And here, obviously, when I spoke to the police about the law there, just to kind of interview them and understand what was going on. Once I told them it was in the back, it was in the boot, it was taped and stapled and the rest of it, they said, all right, pull on. I said, can I interview you? And they said, you're blocking traffic. I said, can I pull over and interview you? And he goes, yeah, all right. So I spoke to him for about half an hour, and then one of the questions I said to him, conscious of the way the laws are here, is like, what happened? How did the transition work between it being illegal and being legal in terms of how you dealt with it? And he says, well, we were hard asses, was his exact word. We're hard asses because it's illegal. Once it became legal, then we had to change because the law changed. People didn't hate us for enforcing a bad law, And that changed everything in terms of driving. And I said, what about impairment? He goes, I'd rather deal with a cannabis person under the influence than a person drinking. So this is how the society changes and the rest of it. But back to the bill, currently, and my understanding, I think is the same as yours, Lorraine, is that if it's inferring that it's possession, or and that I interpret it, if it's a present of an illicit drug in the subject's oral fluid, it goes into a whole lot of issues. If you look at the way the tests work, the bigger the person is, BMI index specifically, the fatter the person is, the worse their BMI is, the longer it will stay in their system. Well, that's constitutionally an issue, which somebody would love to be challenged on, is because if it changes in terms of whether it shows up, whether you're fat or thin, fit or unfit, then that would be deemed a prejudiced law. That's something I'm sure somebody would be interested in picking up in terms of constitutional stuff. So anyhow, that's my thought on that. Any more thought on that one, Lorraine? I've talked too much.
Well, just to simplify,
Thanks.
they can testing for it in your system. The way the law currently stands is for an illicit substance. It's no longer, if the bill passes, it's no longer illicit, so they can't be testing for an illicit substance.
I agree, and that's and again, because the bill is only 20 pages, and as we probably have these conversations, it will keep coming up. It's the things it enables without talking about them. Because if it was to go into the bill and say, right, we're going to adjust driving because the current driving laws are such that it doesn't test impairment, it tests for oral fluids because it's an illicit substance, effectively possession in your oral saliva. If that's now legal, then that law goes away. So they'll have to adapt it. No matter what happens, it has to change. And, I think a theme through all of this is, hey, you know what? Change the right way, or change, period, unless it makes things worse, makes things better.
Exactly.
Do you want to move on to a particular order, like the 15 gram amount one? Maybe that's a good one.
Well, that's a good place to start, because we know, and Adam knows, that that's a very, very small amount, and most people require far more than that. To only be able to have that much on you at any given time, it's logistically, it doesn't make sense that people have to go and try and access daily from somewhere. So we need to cover how people can get around that, or how they can access more.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things in there, the 15 gram one, it came up last year with the original bill in 2017. Of course, it's come up again now. I think the issue with that is that folks are getting hung up and not necessarily seeing where the 15 grams has come from. The actual laws in New South Wales mention 15 grams. Now, right away, they realize, well, if you're making oil for a patient or for yourself or for your family member, that's not enough. But at the same time, they didn't want to go into, again, adding pages and adding baggage to the bill. So what they basically did is
clarify what you mean by baggage, so people get.
Yeah, that's a good point. So here in 2018, we have seen bills and acts and laws enacted since 2015. About 5 bills in Victoria, and then bills in Queensland, WA, ACT, and others. And these do things, everything from worsening laws to changing definitions to what cannabis is, to just making things worse. So the trouble is, if you address all these issues and all these scenarios that's impacting New South Wales specifically, then that bill goes from 20 pages to potentially 400 or 300, and then you've got 400 amendments that you have to deal with, because each of those pages is addressing all this details or baggage of other laws and things that are out there that are making things tough on this. But if you do something in the bill that makes it simple, that you enable that to happen without mentioning it, then you haven't created a bunch of baggage that then has to be addressed and debated in the bill, because people could like the bill but not like this bit, and that's what happens, and that's where you get into 400 amendments like I had in the first bill in Victoria here.
And you don't get time delays, because every time something's got to be discussed or debated on or questioned or worked out, that delays moving forward.
Adam's done a good job in presenting the bill, in that you can just focus on the bill if you read it, and then not so much in these other issues, because at 20 pages there's not much there to complain about if you're opposed. And that's what we're here today doing, here in Australia, trying to answer some questions that folks would have on the bill, and progress things forward on those sort of common questions. What else have you bumped into today? Or last couple of days? I'm sorry. I don't think we covered off. We just talked about that element, but I don't think we really addressed I only addressed half of it. So the issue was that the original law was on 15 grams, and that meant that was the most you could carry if you weren't registered without getting a serious offense against you. So then we go to the scenario, well, beyond that, okay, now I'm making medicine for my family or myself or whatever, 15 grams isn't enough. So the bill specifically addresses that in amounts over 15 grams, that's part of it. That's something that will be addressed, and there'll be a process to deal with that. And that's probably a good time to not...
I guess the problem is that people don't know what that is.
Exactly. And I was just about to...
So many... what are the
Mays? The words like may? They may do this, they may do that. Yeah.
What is going to happen? So they're sort of left dangling. They see the words, they see it written, say 15 grams, or what may be deemed necessary. But who deems it necessary? Who decides how much they can actually get? Is it based on condition? Does the doctor stipulate? Do they tell their doctor? Does the health department decide? This is the kind of questions that they're confused about. Is it the regulators? And who are the regulators that are going to stipulate how much people can actually have? Okay.
So let's answer a couple other questions around that, and then come back to that one, because one of the things that the bill does is it bypasses the TGA. So when
that in itself is huge.
That's huge. So this is why I want to mention that, because then when we come back to, well, who's going to authorize what? So we're talking about the state of New South Wales. So, with you in Queensland and me in Victoria, you think, why the heck are people not in the States not supporting? The issue is that this bill can be cut and paste, because it's a small bill, state by state. And if you look at the bill that they did in Uruguay, it's also a similar sort of framework. So the idea is that if this passes in New South Wales, or fails, whatever, then that can still be cut and pasted and then used state by state, because that was actually a question you asked me very early on. If something happened to the bill, can it still be used? Yes. And this is why I was surprised when Nick didn't bother to go and speak to Adam or anybody else that's doing anything with cannabis, because no matter what anybody thinks and loves or hates this bill, it's the furthest along of everybody else's. And you would think they'd go to the leader of the opposition, Labor in New South Wales, to at least ask opinions and then do whatever you wanted. But that's why things aren't moving forward anywhere else except for this bill.
Well, it's a bill that gets actual cannabis to people.
Well, exactly.
Real cannabis. It's not an isolate. It's not a pharma product. It's not hemp.
It's full spectrum. It's real cannabis.
Real cannabis.
110 cannabinoids, full spectrum. Entourage effect. So, and the other issue of this too is because, in all fairness, I have caught some flack from pharma, and so have others, and the bill doesn't prejudice anybody. It does. The only thing it prejudices, and I have to say thank you, Adam, because one of my soapboxes is that it does address things called cannabis that is not cannabis. And again, it doesn't go into a ton of detail on that, but it does say that we will address these things that aren't what they're supposed to be. The problem is some of the stuff that's legal to be imported pharmaceutically isn't actually getting tested. And when you find out and ask these people, is this product tested? They'll say, well, we've been in business for 15 years. Nobody's died from tap water yet, So
It reminds me of a TV show, never mind the quality, feel the width. You know, it's sort of like, well, we've been in business 15 years, but okay, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah. So today Lorraine is playing the also the role of the American whisperer. So when I say things, she'll translate them into Australian, so they make sense to the rest of the world. Yeah.
No guarantees there, but I'll try.
So the 15-gram thing, I think we've covered that off pretty well. The law is around the 15 grams to protect people because it's in the original law. Keeping in mind, no baggage. We're not changing the law here, per se. So you leave that bit of the law how it is. But then you put in an addendum to say, oh, but by the way, we're conscious that 15 grams ain't shit. So we have a specific chapter that's in the bill that addresses more. But the trouble is, as you raised and others have raised, we don't have the logistics of that. Well, none of the bills on anything that's ever happened has had too many logistics in there. But keeping in mind, Adam was trying to keep the size of the bill down, because the bigger it is, the more amendments you have, the more baggage there is in the bill. So the fact that the details of things aren't there.
More people can complain about it in Parliament. More people can question.
Correct.
There's more things to question.
Exactly
and
right.
It can keep getting delayed.
And that's something we just don't seem to be getting. A lot of people aren't necessarily so conscious of. A lot of people have an expectation they want the bill to be perfect, and it isn't. But is it progress? Is there a risk? You know, it all comes down to risk analysis at the end of the day. Is there a reason why you wouldn't want to pass this bill? And I'm hard pressed to find out what it would be, because it's progress and it's change, and you know we'll go
forward.
Well, it is.
Any way you want to look at it, it's a step forward.
Yeah. So why don't we?
And something that you can build on. What we currently have is, first and foremost, we do not have real cannabis. We have hemp. So first and foremost, it allows people to have real cannabis.
So
what they've been having before.
So let's qualify that statement, because somebody will be thinking as we say that is like, what do you mean they legalized cannabis in 2016?
Well, technically, they legalized hemp.
Yeah. So they legalized hemp. They legalized pharmaceuticals, isolates, GMO, and synthetics, as in not even from a plant.
That's something important to clarify, because I've had people say, oh, I'm getting THC.
Yeah.
And that's fine, but it's an isolate.
Yeah.
It's not full plant.
No.
So when I say cannabis isn't legal, cannabis the plant is not. An isolate is not whole plant. An isolate is just certain cannabinoids. It's not all of them. It's not the entourage effect, which is what everybody, well, I can't speak for everybody, but it's what a majority of people are asking for, is full plant.
So the UN defines cannabis as being over 10% THC and 1% or less CBD. That's the UN's definition of cannabis, and I think globally that's pretty much held. The trouble is that in 2016, when they legalized something called medical cannabis products, that went from a plant, as it is in the rest of the world, to a suite or a bucket of products, and those products don't actually need to include cannabis, and by that definition that we just said. And when people say, and I got to answer the hemp and isn't hemp cannabis and isn't cannabis hemp question, the issue is both hemp and cannabis share a botanical plant genus of Sativa linea or Sativa L. Both of them do, but it pretty much stops there. And then there's been some genetic genome work on actually looking at the difference between hemp and cannabis. I encourage people to go find that. It's from a Dr. Page. It's on my pages, no pun there, but I'll take it. So Dr. Page did all that, and it basically said that the way the hemp works with no THC is different until how it works with cannabis with THC, and that's pretty much a simple scenario. So in that simple scenario, hemp and cannabis, it's not about hemp is bad, cannabis is good, but THC is where the medicine is, from the perspective of the majority of the community, we think.
But it's also about being honest.
And it's about being honest, and nobody cares if people have pharma or weed needles or whatever, but they just need to know what it is.
The big issues is be honest about what you supply.
Absolutely.
It was brought up to me about Charlotte's Web only being CBD, but you go on their site and they say it is a hemp extract. They do not say it's a cannabis extract, they say it's a hemp extract.
Well,
they're being honest about what they're doing and what they're using and what they're making.
Yeah, Charlotte's Web
This is where so much confusion is coming, is because people are interchanging governments, when I say people, are interchanging names left, right and centre, putting things into bills, etc., and nobody knows what the hell's going on anymore. To the point where they've now decided in Australia that they will change the definition of hemp and the amount of THC present in hemp. It used to be 0.3. Now they've changed it so that it's 0.1.
I mean, there's an evolution there, as we were just talking about the other day, weren't we? How hemp was at one period of time 3% THC, then 1%, then 0.3%, and now we're seeing moves for it to be eradicated. And, the question that's come up before, and in all fairness, you and I have been doing this a long time. I don't know the answer to the question. How little THC can you have in cannabis to still have the entourage effect and be full extract? At some point in time, you would think if you got down to, 10 or this is why 10 or 15% THC is the right amount, and then you turn it to oil that's a lot higher, of course. But if you had 1% THC, this is, you're just talking a second ago about Charlotte's Web. There's quite a few articles out there about Charlotte and others that went to Charlotte's Web that wound up moving from it because, and I think the story is that it is a blend of Mississippi hemp with real cannabis, but with very little THC in it, and then they genetically bred out the THC. The trouble is that once they build up an immunity to very low THC, say 0.1% or 1%, because some of the Charlotte's Web was like that, then effectively the THC, which is the medicine, quits working, and then it quits working. So a lot of people have just now gone to regular cannabis, and then of course the new genetics with cannabis is there is higher CBD being bred, which may come from other genetics of cannabis, or it may be GMO, or it may be, there is that hybrid of rudiolis, the little Afghan plants seem to be higher in some cases in CBD. So there's a view that a lot more of that potentially could come in to increase it. And a lot of the European strains of hemp, I mean, there's a lot of people out there benefiting from hemp. But I think the confusion...
Absolutely.
But
it needs to be honest.
They do, and the trouble.
People need to know what they're actually getting.
When people are getting CBD, the CBD with the THC is what makes real medical cannabis work. If they're just getting the CBD, nobody's saying it's going to kill you, but it isn't as good, and it isn't treating you the same way as it is with THC. Somebody said the other day, and it really is just this simple, is it's about stasis. Was it you that told me? That it helps get the body, and it was Karen, it helps get the body to stasis. And it's how I try to explain it, but it's a lot cleaner, simpler way of doing it. Some people say cannabis doesn't cure anything. It just helps get your body back to stasis and empowers you to superpower your body to fix itself. And that sounds, perhaps more true and all the rest of it. Right. Other questions or anything else? What else?
I guess it's terminology in the bill that has people a bit confused.
About the maze? They may do this and may do that?
Yeah, just let me turn to the appropriate page so that I can...
No, that's right. What I'll check.
Trying to find the right page all the time. You just keep reading over and over and over the same thing.
You keep looking and I'll chat while you find it.
Okay, so part 3, access to cannabis for registered medicinal user. Scheme to be established by regulations. Okay, so first of all, I've had questions on who does the regulations. So that's the first point. So, number 1, the regulations may establish a scheme for authorising activities designed to enable cannabis to be obtained for use by registered medicinal users, including the following activities: cultivating cannabis plants, harvesting cannabis plants, manufacturing or producing cannabis, storing cannabis, and E, supplying cannabis. So there's a couple of points there. So first of all, it's a scheme to be established by regulations.
Yeah. So it's actually a good question, and I'm going to guess at an answer. So this is me actually not knowing the answer, so I'll say that ahead of time. I had somebody tell me at one point in time when I was dealing with bills down here, is that in this case, this particular bill is an opposition bill. So they're not in power yet. So that means that the party that's in...
Because it's in New South Wales, where Labor is not in power.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, very good. So Adam Searle, who's the... Yeah, we never spoke about that. Adam Searle, who's the leader of the opposition, which is Labor, because it's, as you mentioned, a Liberal government in New South Wales.
Council. He's leader of the opposition in the Legislative Council.
Yeah, or upper house, as some like to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And the bill that happened last year was lower house, and that was Luke Foley. So same bill written by Adam, same bill this time. Now it's gone to the upper house, and the split of the numbers of the votes are different. So there's a view that we could get a few to cross the line, and this could actually pass. It then has to go to the lower house, but it would be going to the lower house. Adam, and I are talking about this a few days back. But at least when it goes to the lower house, going to the lower house after passing the upper house is going to have more clout than it coming in fresh to the lower house.
Yeah.
So, it's a win. No matter how you phrase it, that would be a major win. And with the votes around 22 to 20 or 24 to 18-ish, then it's tight. So it's doable. If people speak up, if people want it, and the fact that, people do, they just have to speak up.
I mean, what's the alternative?
Exactly.
To continue down the prescription TGA farmer model.
So let's address why this bill isn't perfect, and those that want things in it that should we? I don't want to miss any of the questions. I'm going to write some of these down. We got to address Tony because that seemed to be a question coming up because unfortunately Tony Bauer got arrested.
Well, we haven't covered regulations, and the regulations may establish a scheme. So we need to make sure that's clear to people.
So the thing you were just talking about this last moment ago was the use of the word may do this and may do that. And again, I think I may went off on a little tangent there. So because he's the opposition, then they can't say will. They only can say may is because they're the opposition. But if they're presenting the scenario and the framework that has to fit into it, you also don't want to offer a problem without a solution, but you can't be presumptuous enough to say, you will do this, you will do that, because their retort is, F you, you're not in power. So the may is partly because of that. Plus, if it's a will, then now all of a sudden you're putting in a policy that then gives way to more baggage and questions and amendments. So again, the whole purpose of this bill is to legalize cannabis without people having to get scripts for a very large percentage of the population for a new level of things, legitimize cannabis use for those people that are not treated like criminals and give them the dignity back. And that's what that's about. It's not about fixing all the other issues because they get fixed by accident. And it's not really by accident. As the bill gets enabled, these other things have to be addressed. You got to remember that Australia has spent, how many years of prohibition. This is now chiseling away at that. And then those things don't get fixed overnight. But at least if you say, all right, cannabis is now legal today, things will get fixed very quickly. So on the regulation with the use of the word may, the issue is because they're not in government, they would use the word may as opposed to saying they will, because they don't control it to be able to do it. Now, again, as I stipulated, I don't know if that's the right answer, but I think from a procedural perspective, I think it's a procedural word as opposed to some hidden meaning. But we can understand why people are concerned about the transparency or concern of lack of power of that word. Will, if we will do this, we will do that. That's one thing. Where they may, well, heck, they may not. And we'll get that clarified. I did ask him the question. He has given me the answer, so I apologize for not knowing. Right. Regulations? You raised? Did we just address
Yeah.
that?
A scheme to be established by regulation. So who actually makes those regulations?
Health.
And it has been stated that it is the government that is in power at the time.
Yeah. So yes. So he raised this in. This was raised in the first bill in Luke Foley's video, so it's worth looking at that. The scheme effectively is done by the health department in New South Wales. So it doesn't matter who's in power, whether it's Labor or Liberal. He's saying that that's how it happens. By bypassing the TGA that we mentioned earlier, that is showing that, you know, the TGA isn't needed in a state issue. You know, when we have protests and rallies in Canberra, a lot of the friendly MPs like Hinch and others will come up and go, "Good to see you guys. Why are you in Canberra? This is a state issue." And that keeps happening. People got to remember it's a state issue. So from a state perspective, that's how it is.
Now, we need to clarify that, because what we're talking about is what I refer to as real cannabis.
Yeah.
Being grown in Australia, right? So the TGA is not required. The TGA handles anything coming in from overseas that's unregulated, correct?
Yeah.
Or regulated or unregulated, but it comes through the TGA.
Let's just say TGA/ODC, because the ODC is responsible for imports and the rest of it. It's really the ODC. The TGA has a hand in it, and of course they are the sister organization of the ODC, so there is some natural overlap, but yes.
So the reason for the TGA is anything that's coming in from overseas, in effect.
They're kind of the gatekeeper of the laws around what comes in. So yes, and then the ODC more on cannabis. What's the specific question on the regulation bit then?
It just says scheme to be established by regulations, and I guess people want to know who's going to set those regulations.
Yeah. So you got to remember that the bill, what the intent of the bill is. So anytime you've got a question like that, you say, well, with the intent of the bill. And if the intent of the bill is clear, then any logistics you're putting in place to address that, it's just the logistics within that. So what that scheme will look like, I'll have to be teased out. I'm writing down, you mentioned regulations. I'm thinking somebody had mentioned about this being like ticks. I'll make sure we address that one.
No, I'm coming back to that directly, because that was also a question.
I've not covered off the regulations bit, so maybe I'm not understanding which. So it's okay. So who's going to establish the scheme? It's going to be New South Wales Health. And as you'll see, as you go through these different things and you're changing the law, these are pretty big, huge things. So this isn't a matter of, okay, well, we're going to fix that this way. This is why they're legalizing the ability to buy from the black market, because they know people can't grow crops overnight with good genetics. So the idea is, if people are, if you've got it, pass it and share it. If you're making your own medicine, if you're able to access it from the black market, this bill allows that to happen, which is the reason why government will move quickly, because they don't want that to happen.
They're busily attempting to destroy all that.
Well, apparently there are
under current laws.
Yeah. So some of the pharmaceutical companies that are getting pharma into Australia or out of Australia and the rest of it, some of them are doing real cannabis and some of them aren't. So those that are, some of them would have even potentially had a game plan where let's play along with the CBD game, with the view is that when sanity prevails, we're already there. Now that's a smart way. And I'm not 100% sure who's in that.
It also needs to be made clear that anything that's being grown with THC by companies currently for Australia is only for research and development. It can now be shipped overseas.
Correct.
Where countries allow it, but in terms of Australia, we can't access it at the present time, and it's only for research and development. And all of those licenses cost a bomb.
Yeah.
Currently.
So
if things don't change in the very near future, it's going to be cost prohibitive for anybody to actually get into this. Is another fear that I have.
Yeah.
If things don't change soon.
I want to talk about one thing you just mentioned, because it's actually very, very important. we were talking earlier about the whole definition, and hemp changed and cannabis changed and the rest of it. But you also touched on licensing and R&D, and you and I know what we're talking about there, but a lot of people probably won't. So when they legalized medical cannabis licensing, what they said is what you can grow is based on demand. So this is why a lot of the people saw all these surveys. You know, what color is your hair? Blonde, great. Do you know what CBD is? Yes, right. Next. Everybody was doing surveys on CBD to quantify the demand. Sometimes they were naughty and they used they used the word medical cannabis when it wasn't cannabis they were talking about. They're talking about CBD. The end result of all that is they had an idea of how much demand there was for CBD. So what the government said is you can only get licenses for what there's demand for, and by demand they mean legal demand. So then you got to go to the state and look, well, what conditions are legal to use for cannabis, and it's practically none. So the end result is that anybody that had a license in New South Wales, and again throughout the rest of the country that had the same thing, the end result is there were so few people that had any possibility of any interest that could get legal access to cannabis, that effectively CBD was the only one they did, and everything else had to be CBD. Had to be R&D. So you could grow CBD cannabis hemp, but the real cannabis was for R&D. And then they made a point of saying that R&D means no human consumption for 5 to 10 years, because they're going to want to achieve the gold/Cochrane standard, and that's 3 to 5 or 5 to 10 years. So this is why we have all this urgency today. So the end result of that is then once they legalized it and nobody could access it because it's only for R&D, remember, this then gave way to export. So those that found a way of growing any real cannabis now can export it, but they can only export it to countries that have similar setups to us, because they're also exporting hemp that they're calling medical cannabis here, but they're not calling medical cannabis in the countries it's going to. And that's a mess.
Yeah, it's starting to get very, very confusing and convoluted, isn't it? It's understandable why people have no clue.
Yeah. One of the things,
I shouldn't say it in those words, but
no. One of the things you mentioned. One of the things you mentioned a minute ago was legitimizing legal cannabis, because of the fact that, and again we're just scoffing at the issue, but the bill addresses the problem. Is what it says is for these conditions, which includes chronic pain, neuropathic pain, other conditions as well. If you have those conditions, you do not need to, this is an important one, about the doctors and the scripting. So if you're on this list, then you don't need to go to a doctor to get a script. Then you can just basically start using cannabis and from the black market, or if you have it yourself and you're growing it and the rest of it, however you're getting that cannabis for that medicine, if you've now got one of these conditions, all you got to do is let your GP know, you get registered. It isn't a matter of like the TICS program, and we got to remember to come back to that, where you have to get verified and the rest of it before. If you're already seeing your GP for a condition, say it was epilepsy,
well, we've also got to cover that. If you're going to go into that, we should actually cover that, because currently the almonds are very, very limited. And also, there was a couple that were outside the specialist area, so they were denied.
Yes.
So there's all these things that need to be covered and mentioned as well.
So
there is limited access at present time. There's limited access for ailments at the present time. Now, what people need to understand too is when they're talking about neuropathic pain, what does that cover?
Okay, so I spoke to Pain Australia last year when the first bill came out, because if you Google, what would be without Google? If you Google neuropathic pain by countries, it varies an awful lot. So it's a socio-economical, dietary. So if you look at the West as a benchmark, well, okay. So, but I came up with a number that was around 6% of the general population has neuropathic pain, and that seems to be kind of verifiable out there in the Google sphere.
Well, I actually looked up.
Pain Australia said, let me just finish.
It was Pain Australia, and it had a much higher percentage.
Well, I was just going to say,
So
Pain
much
Australia
higher
told me
percentage
that it was. Yeah, I was about to say.
So the point I'm getting to with this
Yeah.
is that what is listed in this bill is severe intractable epilepsy, HIV, motor neuron, multiple sclerosis, the neurological disorder known as stiff person syndrome,
Yeah, you bet.
severe and treatment-resistant nausea and vomiting due to chemotherapy, pain associated with cancer, neuropathic pain, but it also states an illness or condition declared by the regulations to be a terminal or serious medical condition. Now that seemed to me opens the door to an awful lot of issues.
Okay. So, which is
By comparison to what we currently have, where it's very, very limited as to who is actually allowed it, that to me opens up the doors to a lot more issues. So it means, to me, it means a lot more people will get access. A lot easier.
that's the idea. If it did the same thing that we've got in terms of the status quo, then there would be nothing to support. So it's a good point that we're talking a lot more numbers now. In all fairness to Adam, I have tried to draw him out on numbers, and he doesn't want to go there because, the whole bill started out of a bipartisan discussion, and some of those people that were involved in those are still in the upper house today. And in all fairness, we need some of those bipartisan people. So things have to be kept diplomatic. And again, we're avoiding amendments and the rest of it. So you want it to come to a consensus of how some of these details get worked out. The question has got to be, is there enough of a framework there to make a legitimate bill if you address all those? And then is there enough that can be done to enact and make it all happen? Or is it like, well, this is impossible BS, why the heck are we bothering? And it's not that at all. It is doable, but it's about protecting patients and caregivers and others that are out there just trying to help other people and themselves and their family.
But getting back to what I was saying, it opens the door to a lot more people.
Absolutely.
It gives access to a lot more people than what this system currently does. So,
well, this is why you and I can't understand, and others that are helping us out in this mad, crazy cause, is it just makes sense. It's just like, well, if it doesn't go far enough on that, well, guess what? That's version 2. My view is that if 95% of the Australian population knew that the medical cannabis that got legalized in 2016 doesn't need to include cannabis, I think if the population knew that and that this bill fixes that, I think there'd be a lot more people interested, but the media is not talking about it.
No, the media, a large percent of the media are still referring to it as marijuana.
Well, yeah. And
completely irrelevant in this country anyway.
Which is very interesting without talking different bills. If you look at the one that came out in Victoria a few weeks ago, I think there's 51 references to marijuana in the document. It's just like, I think this kind of sets the tone for we know where this is going, and of course that is where it's going.
It's not a botanical term. It's what angers me.
And
irrespective of anything else, and people will say, oh, that's just semantics, or it's just a word, or what have you. But it also has connotations around it, and the bottom line is it is not a botanical term.
Now, I'm the least hung up person on it because I didn't even know what the word cannabis was after being involved in this for 44 years. I didn't know what cannabis was until a few years ago. So I'm not a person hung up on that word because nobody else is. But I understand the fact we shouldn't be using it and why. But from a research perspective, and when we're following bills and things, quite often the number of times words like marijuana is used in a bill or a bit of a documentation, regardless of context, although obviously context is important, it does give a view of it. Like I looked in that particular same document and the word bipartisan is in there, but nothing to do with the actual discussion, which is interesting because this bill was bipartisan and it came from a bipartisan discussion, and it still needs to be, because part of the support from this bill is still bipartisan with the Greens.
So, well, for my money, when you reference marijuana, you are not clarifying anything.
Yeah, and
For one thing. In this country, you are not clarifying anything.
Yeah,
so
true.
It's either cannabis or it's hemp. But to call it marijuana, and a lot of the times they reference that in certain circles as being, oh, that's what the stoners use.
No, I get all that, but the other
have,
thing,
you have medicinal cannabis and you have marijuana, and they're trying to separate it and create division in that regard as well, and I object to that.
And marijuana is not excluded, because the other thing they've done is they've started. See, marijuana was safe. You know, there was a period of time in evolution where medical cannabis was cannabis. Now, then it means anything. So then cannabis should mean cannabis, but then when they've hijacked the word cannabis, then marijuana as a word was safe, even though some people don't like the word, because cannabis or marijuana was marijuana or cannabis. But then once they hijack the word cannabis, it makes you wonder whether the word marijuana actually is a safer word to use. But now they've hijacked that anyhow. So you've got to say full spectrum in front of whatever you're saying so that people even know what you're talking about. Otherwise, it could be talking about something completely different in the same sentence.
Well, this is the thing, because now I refer to it as real cannabis.
Yeah, I do too.
Because everything has been hijacked, I now refer to it as real cannabis. You know,
and that's what you almost have to do, because it is getting muddled. Right. So, so the last thing you were saying was about the bill opens us up to a lot more people. We haven't really talked about that, but you know, all you got to do Google is the items that you don't have to get prescripted, and we were going to talk on that bit, and that's quite important. So what does that mean if it's not scripted? You don't have to get it scripted. Keep talking. I'll be back.
Okay. Well, first and foremost, you don't have to go to your doctor and attempt to get them to fill out reams and reams of paperwork. One thing I do want to clarify, though, is that this bill does not take away from that. If you are comfortable with having a pharmaceutical product, if you are comfortable with something coming in from overseas, if that's what you want, that is still in place. That is still there. You can still go to your doctor. You can still get a script to go through the TGA, all of that, if that's what you want to do. This doesn't alter any of that. What this does do is change it for those that want real cannabis here in this country and be able to grow it and use what they've used for years and years and years. It doesn't take away from, the two do not compete, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is that they're both still there. When the bill passes, both schemes are still there.
Yes.
So if you want to get a script, you can. If that's how you're comfortable, if you like yours coming in from overseas and you like to know what's in it and how it's done and all the rest of it from a pharmaceutical perspective, then that is still available to you. That doesn't change. But what does change is for those that, especially for argument's sake, for cancer patients that want full THC, for arguments, they'll be able to access that, which currently they cannot. When you have a 1-to-1 ratio, THC to CBD, 1-to-1 ratio, that's going to do very little for a cancer patient.
Right.
But if they want full spectrum, then that's what this will achieve.
Yeah, so the where we kind of a tangent before I went off on a tangent or choked and almost died. So,
You go off on a tangent.
No, I don't believe in it. Was we talked a minute ago about legitimizing legal cannabis with all this other stuff going on. By them now saying that all these conditions, and this goes back to what you said a moment ago, Lorraine, because it's a purposeful tangent, is that once you've now enabled all these conditions to now be able to have legal cannabis, then what? You know? And that's the issue, because at the moment, the view is that nobody has legal access to real cannabis. So there's no instant product. Mentioned before, and again when we talk more about Tony Bauer, the bill specifies small local grows or larger grows, any size grow you've got. which is huge for the likes of the Tony Bowers of this world. So the trouble is that the licensing is set up to where, unless you've got millions to put up front for your medical cannabis, which of course, keeping in mind, is mostly hemp. All this millions of dollars in security for something nobody wants. Opium fields are open, you can run up to them, but they've got security for hemp fields. You know, they got the wrong idea. But the bill protects the Tony Bowers of this world because it allows grows to be addressed. And the thing is, it says effectively, once it's legal, now you can buy from the black market until the New South Wales Health Department sets up a program to fix it. And because Adam is emphasizing local grows and not imports, then this is where the Tony Bowers in this world can prosper.
Yeah, and you need to clarify that because there are people that are afraid that the health department are going to create a government-run grow.
Yeah, and in all fairness, if it wasn't addressed, I'm sure they would. And government, and I think government will. I think we'd be silly to think the government won't. But at some point in time, as soon as you get the government growing, it legitimizes the whole thing, and that's what happened in Canada. That's how they passed the law to begin with. Is in that actual law there, the government said we're going to grow it, and we're going to be the sole provider of it, and the people said no, and that's how it got legal. That's how it all started off. So. But it's still progress. Even if that was to happen, which we don't, nobody wants that to happen, it won't happen. But even if that did, that's still growing real stuff. But the bill specifically addresses small and large commercial grows. There's no point really going there. But he mentions it specifically because it's important. So by legitimizing the legal cannabis on that sentence there, from going to the bit where now you have all these products that you can have cannabis for. Now you need supply. How does supply work? Well, the view is, you start with the black market, and then you get a grow going. And you know how many people have got grows that are legal, good quality, clean, organic in Australia or in New South Wales specifically, that could all of a sudden raise your hand and say, you're now supplying the government, or you're now our caregiver, or whatever the case may be, and we need to tease out this stuff. But you know that's what he's got in mind. You know, this isn't a matter of let's import all this stuff today and get going on what's going on. And in all fairness, there will be people already in Australia, the Bedricans and folks of that have really good product, and they may be growing quickly in Australia. So there'll be companies that are providing pharma and CBD and the stuff we don't want that happen to be more into real cannabis products, but they're trying to get a foot in the door in Australia while we figure out what the heck we're doing. So you can understand that model being out there as well. But then there's others that only want hemp to be out there, and that's a challenge for us as well.
Because Adam mentioned, he was questioned and asked, you mentioned that registered users will have criminal sanctions lifted. Does this mean that patients would be prosecuted for accessing black market products? And the first answer to that was no. That's the key thing. There's some criticism of this originally, but what we are recognising is that because of the lack of any effective legal access, people who are needing treatment today are being forced onto the black market. Now that's undesirable because you're getting products of variable quality with different properties, and they may not be properties that you need to treat what you have. Really, you do not know what you're getting. It's a bit of a potluck when you buy from the black market supplier. But we recognise that people are forced into this circumstances, and so we don't want sufferers or their carers, who are often the acquirers, to be criminalised. What he goes on to say, though, is that doesn't lift the criminal sanctions for the dealer, which I understand is not an ideal solution. It is what I would call a pragmatic compromise, pending the lawful supply chain being established. So he's stating there that you can buy from the black market. Now, if you are selling from the black market, you're right in saying that you are not protected.
Correct.
But having said that, if you are then listed as a carer for someone,
there you go.
then you can apply to have a license to grow.
So, so everything you just mentioned right there, and this is a cultural, huge change from the status quo. And each of those things. So, keeping in mind this bill is still only 20 pages long. It hasn't grown to 500 in the hour we've been talking about it. This is still only a 20-page bill, and everything we're talking about is in there and addressed, and he's done good interviews that address these questions. So there's so much in what you just said. We're not going to get into the whole, oh my goodness, there's some people in Australia selling oil or giving oil away and it's not very good, and we're not going to go there, but that's the case. And some of that's by accident, some of it might be on purpose, but the bottom line is people can't get testing. And as long as you have all these illegal products and there's no testing of an illegal product, then it makes it hard for people to do it. And even batches can vary. So if people do a batch and it can be great, the next batch can be poop, and we're seeing that too. But the fact that in California especially, you can go to these places, go in, get your stuff tested while you wait, sort of thing, put it in a machine, come out, go have a coffee at the other end and whatever, and then it's done. So, or sometimes they take days depending on which labs they are. But just to be able to do that so people can get better quality material than the black market can be providing, and knowing what they're doing, because it's terrible. Every time we hear about a child dying because even though they're taking medicine, you got to query how good was that person's medicine, and did they have a constant supply, and all the rest of it, or did they not have any medicine?
I think one of the big issues there is constant supply. I think more than anything, it's constant supply, and being in hospital and not being able to access and things along those lines.
I mean, wouldn't it be...
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, wouldn't it be beautiful to be able to map the genetics of cannabis in Australia, so that in New South Wales in this case, that they knew what was where, and those that have got good grows were able to supply medicine rather than having them confiscated, and the helicopter raids and the rest of it that happened.
Yeah, I mean, think of the money saved.
Absolutely.
Think of the money that's currently going into these raids. And my personal opinion is, because of the way the legislation is currently, is that they are attempting to wipe out THC. That's my personal belief. Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
Can you repeat that?
It seems to me that they are attempting to wipe out THC that they are not controlling, that pharma, etc. are not controlling.
I think that's pretty undeniable. And the trouble is that there are some out there that are saying that's not the case, and they're the ones involved in doing it. We're not naming or shaming anybody here, but that is happening. And no, I don't think it's a unfair assumption in the rest of it.
Okay, so something else that came up, a question that Adam got was, the provisions set out in the bill are very flexible. Does it allow for smaller producers to register for a license and produce more artisan products? And he said yes, but he goes on to say, in theory, it would facilitate small-scale production or large-scale commercial production. Mm-hmm. That's why it's so flexible. Yeah. So
plus he mentions home grows.
What people have is, he said, in theory. So that is not saying absolute, and unfortunately, because we've had so many bills come through that have been chopped and changed, and they say they're going to be one thing and then they're another thing, and they've hidden bills inside a bill, or amendments and changes inside a bill, etc., that there is some concern when it says in theory it would facilitate small scale production or large scale.
So in theory is, again, two things. One is, we have to remember that Labor has to win an election, hopefully for them in New South Wales in about a year or so. So they don't necessarily want to seem to be soft on drugs, but at the same time they're supporting a very important cause and the rest of it. So the fact that sometimes they're coy in some of their comments isn't something that people should be too concerned about. Plus the fact that in theory, also again being reminding that they're in opposition, they're not in government. So if they say they will, then again they're saying, aha, Well, let's tear into this one for a while. So anything that's too definite means baggage / debate / amendments, and not something you want in the bill. So yeah, if it's thin on some of that detail, those details will have to get worked out for the logistics to work, but they're not answered in the bill because the bill doesn't go into that sort of granular detail on purpose.
And that to protect the bill, to get it passed so that there's not too much debate in Parliament on it.
Yeah. When they go to put the infrastructure and all around all this, I guarantee you there'll be plenty of time for debate, but hopefully a good time for bipartisanship again. The bill was done, as we said, in bipartisanship.
But once the bill is passed, it can't be unpassed, and then it's a case of sitting down and knotting it out that everybody's happy, correct?
It can, yes is the easy answer. It can be unpassed later. It wouldn't get unpassed like that day, but changing government and the rest of it, or in the actual bill or in one of the items or in the article, it mentions that there's a review period. So I think that 3-year review period, was it 3 years? I think, wasn't it?
What I'm referring to is when it comes time to actually putting it into practice, not when government changes or anything further
No,
down the
correct.
track. Putting this into practice.
Yes.
And stipulating, Adam sitting there stipulating what he wants, for argument's sake. It's not a case of, well, we don't agree to that, so, we're going to unpass the bill. That's not
correct.
an issue.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
going
It
to
doesn't.
happen. It'll be a case of nutting it out and
Correct.
doing it to the way he wanted it.
Yeah.
Once it's been passed, it'll be a case of pushing for the things that he stipulated and the things that he wanted.
When they legalized cannabis in California, they initially called the bill, us that were trying to get through, called it the Pandora Box Bill, because we knew that once this happened, it was the beginning, and it didn't matter how ugly it was coming out. And in some ways, this bill's a lot further along than the whole script thing is genius. Because this is another thing worth mentioning. We skipped over the script bit. Is that a lot of doctors, and Adam is the one that told me this, and I've heard it from others as well, is that a lot of doctors don't want to be script writers because there's a lot of pressure federally. There's a lot of pressure from the AMA and other groups and the rest of it. That will change. They're doing it because that's their politics, and they're the rest of it. But
I think it's also too because they're unfamiliar with it, so it makes it very difficult for them to be scripting something they're not familiar with.
I don't see it that way. My view and the way I had explained to me from a weed doctor in California was, you guys have Panadol or in Australia, and I said, well, that works basically on your endocannabinoid system, the same thing cannabis does. So if they're not confident on quote-unquote cannabis, then how are they able to suggest and prescribe various strengths of Panadol and other paracetamol and other things that work on the human cannabinoid system as well? When you ask a doctor that here...
So is it more because they're not being protected with insurance?
Well, not more than, but that's part of it. So there's that. You have the fact that the information that the doctors have got has been sent over by NDARC and NCPIC via other paths. So when the AMA,
Who are they?
I'm sorry, the NCPIC was the National Cannabis Prevention thing. They're kind of the propaganda wing of the Australian government. They did some good work on dealing with people that thought they were addicted to cannabis, but they took it to an extreme to basically have a view that cannabis was addictive, and then when trying to quantify it, they really couldn't. But they wrote books about it. So that's the NCPIC. They were a organization sitting under NDARC, which is the National Drug and...
I believe it got... NC... What's it called? Sorry.
NCPIC, Jan Copeland got defunded.
Yeah. I do believe that got disbanded though.
Funny enough, there was a bill last year to refund NCPIC, and a bunch of us jumped all over that. NDARC is, of course, the National Drug and Alcohol Research Center. When a bill has really negative stuff about cannabis, from causing schizophrenia to everything else, NDARC's the one that's sourced that from somewhere, especially if it's old research. So we talked about legitimizing legal cannabis, buying from the black market, and we've kind of touched on that a bit. So the idea, as you mentioned, is that, so how are you going to get the cannabis? Well, initially, effectively, you'd be buying from the black market initially. But of course, the whole impact of that, now it's in the black market, can then become caretakers, caregivers.
Because that has to be very clear that because it stipulates that the people selling on the black market are not protected.
Correct.
But they can then become carers.
Correct.
Now, do we know, or do we assume, or do we have any knowledge of how many people you can be a carer for?
No. So that's in the detail, and I agree it's a good question. But it would also make sense if I think it would depend. I don't know if it's. See, I don't know, by the fact that it's not defined is maybe a really good thing. I think as many of these things as, they when they legalized in California, and I'm sorry I keep referring to it, but some things were nailed down pretty well, some things weren't. And some of the things that were nailed down worked really well, and then some of the things that were nailed down didn't, and some of the things that were a bit random caused problems, and in other cases they helped a lot. So everything's fluid.
Adam's bill is also based around the California model, isn't it?
There's aspects to it. There's a lot of influence in there. Dr. K.
What I come back to is that in theory it would facilitate small-scale production or large-scale commercial production. So that, to me, would say that you could be a small-scale producer, which I would assume be 150 to maybe 500 plants. To me, would be what they would classify as small-scale. Commercial, you're getting up into the thousands, would be my thought. Right.
So the California model, and Colorado is, I think, taking it on as well, was effectively that remember we said before, we got to go over this doctor's script thing. That's so important. So if you've bypassed your doctor's script, then you would be able to have a certain amount based on your condition without getting a script from your doctor. I could see a scenario where, and we don't really know the answer, so it's a good question, is how does somebody wind up, what's the detail of the logistics of that registration program? What's it actually going to look like? And it will come up again. We just don't have that level of detail. The fact that they've suggested putting the framework forward, regardless of how many holes there is that a hole? Well, it has to be addressed. Anything that has to be addressed for the bill to work. The worst thing that happens is nothing happened except for the fact it's legal and everybody has to buy from the black market and the black market's not protected. That's a worst case scenario. But if you're saying carers and caregivers are legal, then guess what? If I'm a grower, I've just become a community caregiver or a single caregiver because it's still the same thing.
Another issue, of course, is there are people that don't want to grow.
Of course.
Don't know how to, don't have the time, are not well enough, don't have somebody that can do it for them, etc., etc.
I'm one of them.
We need somebody that is willing and prepared and able to do it for them. So that's an important point also.
Yeah, and there'll be some of those people that want to buy real cannabis, real full spectrum cannabis, and they want to buy it from a pharmacy. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. This bill isn't about preventing anything. It's about truth and legitimizing legal cannabis for medical use. It's just that simple. And giving dignity back to those people that are criminals, the Bens and everybody of this world that are out there that are having to deal with this.
Well, for my money, I'd prefer it wasn't through a pharmacy. I'd rather see co-ops or what do you call it? They've got in the States.
Dispensaries?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
So no. I think dispensary is the right direction. The California. I mean, my personal opinion is the California and Colorado. Whatever state does it last tends to do it better than the previous state. So Colorado is really the benchmark as far as I'm concerned, and they've done it right. So if you want to be medical, if you want to go the TGA route, and you were mentioning this before, if you want to go the federal route, TGAA, B or C, I guess is to some extent. If you want to go that route, you still go that route if you want to go that route. This doesn't stop it. You want pharmaceutical cannabis and CBD instead of the rest of it. This doesn't, anything that's called real cannabis, and the idea is this is where the truth starts to come out. If it isn't cannabis, well, you can't call it cannabis. But if you want pharmaceutical, it's...
People know the truth. If they know what they're getting,
yeah,
that's huge.
Then they can decide. Then they can decide.
That is a big step as far as I'm concerned, that people know what they're getting.
One of the things that was a movement forward for a lot of people's thinking in the U.S. was when they, and somebody said, you realize that when we legalize cannabis for medical use, you've effectively going to reduce the recreational population by potentially 20 or 30%, and the need for the black market by 20 or 30%. Those are some pretty huge numbers, because if you think about it, because cannabis is illegal for medical use, everybody that uses it for medical use is really, in the eyes of the law, a recreational user.
Exactly.
You and I can call it medical, and it is medical, but the law calls it recreational. As soon as you legitimize real cannabis for medical use, those then recreational users are then medical users, and things change then as well.
I mean, it's a little bit of semantics, I guess.
Oh, it is.
In the wording and terminology and everything else. But the end result is people get access. And that's what's important. That people get access. Something else that needs to be covered is ending prohibition across the board.
Oh, yeah.
It has to be covered because there are those that just want to see it completely ended, finito, done with it. It's been alive for the last 80 years. Can't deny that. That is truth. It has been alive. It should never have been prohibited in the first place. There's no denying that. But the logistics of that ever happening, or at least that happening anytime soon.
So my way of explaining, go ahead. Well, I was going to say my way of explaining that is, what's the legal precedent for it in Australia or globally? And then you get some people that mention Portugal, and then I've got some senators that recently went to Portugal. Oh, we need Portugal. Well, the trouble is that the UK did a delegation recently to Portugal, and the conclusion of that was what's gone on with legalization in Portugal, which actually Portugal is having some problems with now. But the other thing is it won't work in other countries, because the reason why it worked in Portugal is because they had a larger cross economic population of people that were drug addicts. They went further across the spectrum, and then it does.
Drug addicts too.
Yes, heroin mainly being the issue. So this was mainly a heroin act, but the idea is that because cannabis is a gateway drug off of harder drugs, part of it was leaving cannabis and all that in there. So what the UK delegation realized when they left, they said in the paper, is that it's not for them because it's the wrong demographic and the rest of it. Australia, those that have been there, nobody seems to have quite caught on to that. And this was coming from the guy that wrote the laws in Portugal. This wasn't just some blogger like me.
Well, irrespective of all the other drugs, forget anything else, but purely from a cannabis standpoint, just look at purely ending prohibition on cannabis.
There's no legal precedent anywhere in the world for it. So it hasn't worked. Aquarius has been going on since 73 in Australia. How's that worked? And this is the trouble, and my tagline on this is, don't confuse ideology with legislation. Meaning, whether you're for or against the legalization of cannabis, I think it should be legalized recreationally. I'm all for it. It's funny enough, I've been accused of not, but my view is sensibly. I lived in California. I've seen at the Cup a couple of years ago in Colorado. I've seen what works, and if you've seen the bits of Canada that kind of work and don't, and then you see what really has worked in California and what really has worked even better in Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, and all these other states that are going legal, once you've seen what it does to the economy and how it works and how simple it can be, you think, well, if you're trying to legalize it, then why not at least consider that? Why reinvent the wheel and leave round off the table? So it works. So if there's no precedent for removing prohibition, then how are you going to do it? Where's that bill? Adam Searle was very careful to say, if you say no to this bill, fine, others maybe should be doing the bill, but offer a good alternative instead.
So technically, nowhere in the world has removed prohibition. They have legalized.
No other country has legalized recreational before medical.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that prohibition has not been eradicated anywhere, has not been squashed anywhere. It has been legalized.
I'd have to ask you what your definition of removing prohibition is, because I'm a foreigner.
Well, I guess my understanding here in Australia, removing prohibition would be taking it completely off the TGA. That there are no stipulations around it. That there's no difference to growing a cannabis plant to growing a tomato plant.
I think you should stop. I think you should stop there for a second. I think we can stop there for a second, just so we can absorb something you just said about the TGA. Say that bit about the TGA again. I don't think it can be underemphasized. I think it's very important. Say it again. What you just talking about the TGA.
Removing it from the TGA. Removing it from any schedule.
Yes. So the bill offers the opportunity to bypass the TGA. The TGA doesn't like that. The ODC doesn't like that. The government doesn't like that.
So in effect, it kind of is removing prohibition.
Yes. Now, my definition of prohibition is it legal? And my view is when you said legal, now Adam doesn't use the word legalize in this bill anywhere. I looked and I looked and I prayed and I looked and said, one of the first words I looked for, okay, it's not there. But it allows it. So, again, if you legalize something, you throw in a pretty interesting book of baggage. Now, the fact that it's legalized, the laws have to change. Oh gosh, we got to talk about driving. That's a big one.
Well, we did. We discussed that in the beginning.
Oh, okay, good. Glad you were there. I forgot. So yeah, that's a big issue. And ticks was the other one about the. Somebody raised the question about, isn't this just an opportunity?
Yeah, it was. Well, the problem with the ticks is that people signed up for that as users, and people signed up as carers, and then people were getting rated. Yes.
So the way that worked was you signed up for it, and part of the qualification, quote unquote, process was you were leaving yourself up to unannounced police visits. So when they came out to check your there's a legal word for it. It's decency and something or other. When they come out to do that human decency check, well, who's going to be applying to grow legal cannabis except somebody that potentially might be growing illegal cannabis? So when the police arrive and find you with illegal cannabis, they say, well, you can't, you have to ask before you do it. This isn't a registration program like the Adam Searle bill is going to be in 2 years' time when people finally come to their senses. This is something different. This means you've just gotten busted. Thank you very much. So the police chief in Sydney was on one of the programs, and he was saying there was actually one of these. It was a cannabis talk thing. It was terrible, but he was on, and he's saying yes, more people are getting arrested trying to join TIC's terminal cannabis scheme. More people are getting busted than are actually able to get signed up for it. So this is not that. This is a registration.
Well, that's kind of what we need to make very clear, is that it's very different from the TICS program, because this actually legalizes cannabis, and then you are legally allowed to use cannabis, and then you apply for a license to grow, or be a carer, and grow, or you can grow yourself, but you are legally able to do that because cannabis has been legalized.
Yes, one important
to the TICS program.
Yeah. So one important point on that, we were talking about the doctor scripting and not wanting to script and all the rest of it. The other aspect of that is when a doctor doesn't have to. No, I forgot where I was going to go with that one. What were we just talking about? Sorry.
TICS and
TICS.
the fact that
So
this bill actually legalizes cannabis.
Yeah. So
therefore, you are using and signing, getting your registration through the health department, not signing up for a TIC program where cannabis is still illegal, in effect.
So it doesn't require it doesn't require a visit by policemen with guns as part of your registration process. Now, me personally, if I still knew I was going to get registered, I'd probably submit to that. That'd be fun. But no. So TICS was a ill-thought-out, ill-conceived, and ill-run scheme. And this is nothing like that. Again, you got to go back to the intent of it. The intent of TICS was never to make it easier and better for people. It was to make it difficult for people, but to fulfill a political promise. This is somebody doing a bill based because he's been touched by the issue personally, and others have as well that have come to him to say, this is what's happening in the real world. But the trouble is, enough people aren't coming forward to yell about it yet.
Well, this is the thing, they've got to realise that even in Parliament, he spoke up about his father using it. He came out and said that his father used it because when he did the Law Society interview, they asked him, can I ask how this medicine has touched your life? And he said, my father died from cancer. And I saw that medicinal cannabis alleviated a number of his symptoms. His pain, it helped to stimulate appetite after chemo, and it provided many beneficial effects to him that were not available through other forms of more traditional pharmaceutical medicine. There are other forms of pain relief, but they compromised quality of life, whereas the medicinal cannabis didn't. It actually made quality of life more accessible. So he's witnessed it firsthand. So to me, he's coming from a compassionate point of view.
Exactly. And when you look at how you change a law in Australia, and what we've seen in the last few days with, before the South Australia election, you had Nick, putting a memo through saying if we get elected or become kingslayers, we'll legalize cannabis. That would have been interesting, but of course he didn't get in. And then you had the one in Victoria where they basically put a 600-pager together saying we need to do more about having medical cannabis products looked into, which isn't cannabis. So that's a shame. So there's no bill there.
That was still a medical model. It still wasn't full plant
Correct.
cannabis. It was still a medical model.
Well, they mixed it all up. They put in a definition. They put in a link to a story about real cannabis, and then they're referring to pharma, and they're doing it all in one. But the end result is, it's medical. And then we had the Pauline Hanson urgent notion to emotion scenario, which a lot of people misquoted is them passing and changing the schedule of the of cannabis. Well, that was what was proposed, but they said yes. You're here. Congratulations, and they go beep. That's it. That's bye. That's the end of the motion. And everybody just tore her apart, and poor Hinch had to save her. Hinch had to come down and bless his heart. He's such a good-hearted person. I've never met the guy, but and he freaks out and always reminds people he goes to Nimbin for 5 years. It reminds me of my mother. It used to go to the same store for 30 years, and it shut 20 years ago. She's forgotten. But
the bottom line is that in federal parliament with Pauline, is that nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed, so that nothing happens as a result of it. The thing in Victoria, nothing happens with it. They've put a proposal through, and there's no proposal element in there that has anything to do that helps real cannabis, and there won't be a bill. The trouble is, and this is why we go back to Adam. So when you go to change the law, what's the perfect scenario? Well, you either need to change the law, you need a legal challenge, or you need a bill. Great. So you get a bill. The best person to get a bill is somebody that's in power. Well, that's unfortunate. Next one.
So
Also, let me finish this. Let me finish this point. Then the next best person you can have to do a bill would be an MP that's suited to the cause in the opposition. If the government's not going to be able to do it in that state, and who's the best person in the opposition would be the leader of the opposition of the upper house, and that's who's actually written this bill, and that's something that can't be underemphasized either. Sorry, go ahead.
and presented it himself personally.
Yes.
And spoken out about his father
Exactly.
for using it. No.
So that was schemes, caregivers, black market. I had a guy tell me in Colorado, and interesting when we were talking about law reform recently online, he was saying it wasn't until it got legalized recreationally that patients were better protected, because the recreational users, they don't want the pharma stuff at all, right? Recreational users want full spectrum cannabis. So those that are out there thinking that this doesn't wind up in an end path of helping put forward the cause of recreational, it can. The bill's got nothing to do with that. But once you get this sort of thing legal, and it's legal for medical use, evolution is evolution.
And it's what I said in the very first video before this was even presented again in the upper house, is that it is a stepping stone in the right direction. What we currently have is a stepping stone to nowhere except more pharma, more regulation, more pseudo-cannabis.
Yeah.
This, at the very least, is a stepping stone in the right direction. And first and foremost is that it legalizes raw cannabis.
The first time you and I chatted...
Go
ahead.
Much, much sooner to people in a very short space of time.
So says the dog.
Yeah, he's been very helpful.
Good. Not barking mad.
So I'm not sure if we've left anything out.
Doctors, script, legalized caregivers, schemes, the 15 amount, the motion doesn't happen. So I guess you were touching on the prohibition bit of it. So maybe we didn't really dive in that enough. The trouble is if we wait for something that does something more that there's no legal precedent for, then people have got to realize, like we did in California in 1995, that it wasn't going to work. So the view is you got to make a step forward, and this is a huge step forward. And people need the medicine. So, well, thanks, Lorraine. We've gone for an hour and a half, so I think that's enough.
The bottom line is that as this gets cannabis into the hands of people very, very soon, as opposed to there is no other bill. There is nothing else before Parliament, before government, in the works that changes anything today. I mean, this bill is about to be voted on, and it could make changes very, very soon. as opposed to holding off for something bigger and better that may or may not ever come.
It just sounds crazy even saying it, doesn't it? Do you want to talk?
I would much rather have this right here, right now, as a stepping stone in the right direction, as opposed to what we currently have, which is nothing, as far as I'm concerned.
So let's talk a little bit about how people can help. And we'll take turns on this one. I'll give one, then you give one. My first one is every rally, every barbecue, every bar mitzvah, everything protest you have that's supporting the legalization of cannabis in any shape, whether it be recreational, prohibition, medical, or whatever, it needs to be supporting a change in the law. It doesn't matter if it's a legal change and you're going to support something on a crowdsourced fund, or you're going to support this bill or somebody else's bill if somebody else has another bill. But to do it for just change the law because we think government's going to listen, if we're not doing it and we don't have an MP doing it for us with a bill like we do at the moment, it's not happening. That's my first one.
Oh, exactly. If there has to be a bill. Bottom line is the only way law is going to change is with a bill. So you have to be supporting something. Going out there and protesting without any direction or any purpose or any meaning, just to say we're pissed off at you, isn't going to change anything.
No. Be part of the solution. Be part of the solution, not just part of the problem.
That's going to change something. So even on, as people know, I've had Stand Up for Cannabis going around on the 5th of May. Also want to stipulate that it's not in competition to Nimbin. Nimbin is also a part of the marijuana march that is held every year around the country.
Do they actually know that?
I did contact Nimbin and ask them, and they said yes.
I know they eventually got added onto the list, but they weren't even. You were on the list before they were.
No, they were on the list.
Oh, were they on the list? Okay.
They were already on the list.
So this is just empowering people that can't get to Nimbin.
Yeah, it's 889 cities around the world, and I think it's something like 80 countries are involved in the Million Marijuana March every year. Unfortunately, it is called marijuana because it initiated in America.
Oh, how dare they! Those Americans.
Marijuana March, right?
Boo Americans.
So when I decided to do this, I looked for something that had meaning, and that's what it was. We're joining in a global marijuana march. Falls on the same date as Nimbin, but my other reasons for it was because not everyone can get to Nimbin for whatever reason, be it finances, being health, being distant. Not everyone can get to Nimbin. So, and the same with the big cities. Not everyone can get into the big cities. We all talk about wanting these massive big rallies in the city, but not everyone can get to them for whatever reason. Okay? So I thought, well, let's do it in our own hometown on the same day. Isn't that, in effect, having the same effect as a massive big rally in the city? If you've got cities and towns all over Australia doing the same thing all on the same day, that is thousands and thousands of people standing up for the same thing, for the same cause, right? So that was the whole premise around Stand Up. But the point I'm getting to is on the website, which is standupforcannabis.com, there are postcards on there that they can send to the Legislative Council saying to vote for this bill. That's just a starting point. They can just send these in an email, vote yes. So that's a really simple thing they can do, is just to send them out to all the Legislative Council saying to vote yes on this bill. It's really simple. Just download it, send it off in an email. That's just something very basic that anyone can do from sitting at their keyboard.
And that's it. And it really is an interesting scenario. I've seen some folks have actually put up some of the letters and things in the feedback, and some of them are quite interesting. And even if you get a negative response from somebody, the fact you're getting a response, the fact they're seeing it, it makes a difference. You know, the issue has been long that they're not seeing it. And Adam has said that, you know, when he's spoken to other MPs in the past, it's like, you know, anybody coming to you and talking to you about this sort of stuff, you know, the answer is no in the past. So the fact that people are emailing and asking questions and, you know, why are you as an MP that's representing me, why are you stopping this sort of thing? You know, that makes a difference. Whether better face-to-face, but better in an email than nothing, but definitely better face-to-face.
Absolutely. But again, you come across the same problem. If you're a carer, you can't always get out and about.
Correct.
If you're unwell, you can't always get out and about. If you're in the suburbs, you can't always get into the city. So for those people that can't actually get in there in person, and you just turn up on the hope that there's somebody there to see, you know, because trying to get an appointment is not always easy. So if you can go in person, all the better, absolutely, without fail. But if you can't, then just send an email every couple of days. Just keep sending that same email with the postcard. Print it off and send it as a postcard. Send it as an actual physical postcard. You know, so they keep getting them in the mail. If they keep getting them in the mail all the time, they can't ignore it. You know, it's a lot easier to push something aside that they're not seeing every day. If they're seeing it daily from people, from thousands of people, they can't ignore it. I did stipulate that people in New South Wales are the most important, obviously, because at this point in time, it's a New South Wales bill. But even if you're in another state, it doesn't matter. It just shows that the whole country is on board and wants this. It's not just a select few. Now, I was surprised to see that I rang my local MP, who is Labor in Queensland here. I rang my state MP and trying to get an appointment and being a little bit stonewalled, I have to say. But they said I'm the only person in my area that has rung them on this matter. Because I said, this is what the people want. And she said, well, you say that, but you're the only one that's ever contacted us. So that's a bit of a worry too.
Well, and that's going to be the same issue all over the country because, you know, when you hear the stories about the kids being taken away and the rest of it, you know, people have said nobody's ever been arrested for going to see their MP. Well, if you send a letter to your MP saying, I'd like to come and visit you and this is all my interest in drugs and the rest of it, I would be, you know, would he be remiss? What if he was a lawyer by profession? Would he be legally responsible to have to hand that over to law enforcement? I mean, what's his, you know? So I'm not saying people shouldn't. I'm just saying we can definitely understand why people are concerned.
Exactly.
But the idea of your cards, one of the beautiful things about it, and you didn't use the A word, is that of course they could be anonymous.
Well, they can be, but putting your name and address stipulates then that you are a New South Wales resident and that they will take more notice of it.
There you go.
But there's nothing to say that you are using. You don't have to say, oh, I'm a user. You know, you don't have to say that I'm supplying it or I'm using it or anything else. And the other side of it is that you don't have to be a cannabis user to support cannabis.
Correct. Of course not. That's a good point too.
You don't have to have cancer to support cancer awareness. So you don't need to be a cannabis user to support cannabis.
I think we should wrap this up at an hour and 40 minutes.
Well, I mean, it is an important subject, and there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of things to cover. And I can guarantee you that even after all of this, there will still be a lot of questions.
Well, I hope there is, because I hope it makes people think about what they're doing and think about how they can help to do the bill. The thing you just mentioned about regardless of where you are, if you're not in New South Wales, you know, you've probably seen the memes. If you're in New South Wales, the list that's out there is, it shows those in green that are supporting it, those in red that aren't, those in yellow that are on the fence, and we've already gotten one of those over. And then the nationals in Labor in New South Wales that are on the list, they're a good opportunity to get them across. They've offered interest in legalization as well.
One thing we should make clear before we go to is that getting this passed in New South Wales Legalization is a state issue, okay? We've already covered the whole prohibition thing, right? So we're moving beyond that, and getting it legal is a state issue. So we all need to support New South Wales in getting this through, and then we need to support our own individual states in getting an MP to present it to our Parliament.
Yes, each state.
In our respective states.
Yeah.
So and having it passed. And I think it'll be much, much easier once it's passed in New South Wales. I don't think it'll be as difficult to get somebody on board in your own state outside of New South Wales to have somebody then present it. Because one of the key things, I think, of politicians avoiding it is it being a waste of time. They don't, if they're doing it as a private member bill, they don't want to waste what little time they have on something that may or may not go through. So
Absolutely.
if it's already passed in New South Wales and they've seen the support from other people and around the country, then I think it'll be much, much easier to get it through into other states. And before we realise the whole of Australia will be legal, because you cannot have it so that, yes, you can use it here in New South Wales, but if you go on holidays to Queensland, suddenly your child now cannot have its medicine that it needs, or your family member that is ill with cancer can no longer have their pain relief because you've chosen to take them to the Gold Coast, you know.
Well, if you talk, and if you talk to our friend John, we'd probably say that even now, because you've got different laws in different states, we could say that constitutionally it's not fair state by state to be varying so much, but that's another story for another day. And that's in terms of winding up. Where can they go to find what you're doing with stand up?
Well, there's the Facebook, of course, which is the Facebook /groups/stand up for Canna. For whatever reason, I couldn't do cannabis. It had to be Canna. But the website is standupforcannabis.com.au. My apologies, I said it wrong earlier. It is .com.au. And so the postcards are on there, which is just a really, really simple way that everybody, and all the information for the members is on there as well. So all the email addresses, they can look up the members list as well. It's all there. So it's really simple and straightforward. They can print off the postcards, or they can just copy and paste them into an email and send them through. And even if they do that every couple of days, if those are coming flooding through their email, they have to take notice. They have to take notice of what the people are saying. At the moment, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of Facebook, there's a lot of this, a lot of that, but there's not, from my understanding after speaking to some politicians, there's not a lot actually coming through to them directly.
So we got to have some keyboard warriors out there. Polite emails, everything needs to be polite, love, peace, and all. But just, this is why you need to do it. If they're on the sheet and they're green, then thank you very much. We love you. If you're sending them to those in the red, be respectful. And, this is an issue. This is why. And we know all the reasons why, but, be short, sweet, and articulate it. That's it. So that's your website. On my case, Loren here, twiw.tv. That's This Week in Weed TV. And that's pretty much there on Twitter and Facebook as well.